Okay, so we are now going to read together the new story, Nora's Ark. Remember that this is historical fiction. And so if you turn back to that anchor chart on what historical fiction is on page 539, we can remember that historical fiction is still an imaginary story, but it's based on events that did happen, or it could happen in a place where something happened. Some of the characters can be made up, but some of them may be real. So as we read it, I want you to think, I wonder which of this actually did happen or could have happened and what is made up. Now, as we're reading, I want you to also pay attention to the close reads that we find in the margins of our book. As I'm reading, I will go over some of it. If you're following along, though, or are reading on your own, make sure you are checking out those close reads also, because they're helpful as we go and answer comprehension questions and fill out some of those other questions when we're analyzing point of view and so forth with our story. So feel free, again, to follow along with me or read to yourself or read to a family member in your household. Okay, so Nora's Ark, and this is by Natalie Kinsey Warnock. When I was born, Grandma said I was so small, I look like a little bird. That's why I was named Wren. Grandma may look small too, but she's made of granite, and she says I'm tough, just like she is. Good thing, or we never would have survived the 1927 flood. Do you think that flood actually happened? Grandma and Grandpa lived on a little farm by a river in Vermont. Vermont is a real place. They didn't have much money, but there was always plenty to eat. Milk from Grandpa's cows, vegetables from Grandma's garden, apples and plums from the orchard, fish from the river, and maple syrup that Grandpa and Grandma made each spring. Grandpa was building Grandma a new house. It sat on a hill, and when finished, it would have electricity, a wringer washing machine, and best of all, an indoor bathroom. I don't need a new house, Horace, Grandma said. We lived here 40 years raising 8 children and been as happy as a family could be. That new house is just gravy. What do you mean? I asked her. Grandma thought how she could explain it to me. You like potatoes, don't you, Wren? Yes, ma'am, I told her. Grandma made the best mashed potatoes in the world with lots of milk, butter, and pepper in them. You could make a meal out of just her potatoes. You like gravy on them? I reckon. Grandma did make good gravy, but your potatoes taste good without gravy too, I told her. Exactly, Grandma said. Gravy tastes good, but you don't need it. And I don't need that new house. I like living here. But Grandpa kept right on building. You can see in the picture, he's still building. Now, as we are analyzing the point of view, I want you to remember that a fictional story can be told from the point of view of a narrator. So the grandson is the narrator or the storyteller. A character telling events is first person point of view. A narrator outside of the story gives a third person point of view. All right. And so if you want to go back, I suggest that you underline parts that help you analyze the point of view. So underline pronouns that help you identify the point of view from which the story is told in paragraph 1. And then underline Wren's descriptors that help you understand her grandparents' feelings when we get to paragraphs 22 and 27. The point of you underlining these details is to help you understand the point of view and how the story is being told and the feelings that the different characters are having. So let's keep going. We are on paragraph 13. When it began to rain on November 2nd, 1927, no one along the river had any idea 9 inches of rain would fall in 2 days. Life in Vermont was about to change forever. The rain came down in torrents. It drummed so loudly on the roof, we couldn't talk. Grandma spent the morning baking bread. By noon, she'd made 27 loaves. Grandma, why'd you make so much bread? I shouted. Grandma watched the water stream down the windows. We might need it, she said, but I couldn't imagine how we'd eat 27 loaves of bread. When Grandpa came in for lunch, he poured a quart of water out of each boot. I've never seen the river rise so fast, he said. I think we'd best get up to the new house. For once, Grandma did not argue. By the time she'd packed quilts, candles, her photo albums, and a sack of potatoes, the water was up to the porch. Grandpa let all the cows and horses out of the barn. What will happen to them? I asked. They'll get to higher ground and be all right, he said. Don't worry, Wren. But I could tell he was the one who was worried. So remember, now that we are getting into paragraphs 22 through 27, I want you to start thinking about the grandparents' feelings. Okay, so we already know that Wren can tell that his grandfather is a little bit worried. I loaded all those loaves of bread into my old baby carriage, covered it with an oilcloth, and pushed it through the mud and rain to the new house. Guess I built this place just in time, Grandpa said. If I didn't know better, I'd think you'd cause this flood just so I'd have to move into the new house, Grandma said. But she seemed glad to be on higher ground, too. So if I was having to describe her feelings right now, I would probably use one of our vocabulary words, which was relief. I feel like she's feeling a sense of relief to know that they do have a place to go, because it seems like something pretty bad it might happen to the house that they're in right now. We'd scarcely set food inside when we heard pounding on the door. The three Guthrie boys stood on the porch, burlap bags in each hand. The bags squirmed and squawked. Our barn's flooded. Can we keep the chickens here? They emptied the chickens onto the kitchen floor. Some of our heifers are stranded in the fields, one of the boys said. We're going to see if we can push them to higher ground. I'll go with you, Grandpa said. May I go too? I asked. No, Grandpa and Grandma both said at once. Be careful, Grandma told him, and he and the boys disappeared through the rain. Even with all those chickens, the house seemed empty with Grandpa gone. Grandma saw me shiver and wrapped a quilt around me. It's getting colder, she said. I wish I had my cook stove here. She held me close as we stood watching the rain. I wish Grandpa would come back, I said. Me too, said Grandma. We both shrieked when a huge head appeared in the window. It was Major, one of the Fergusons' horses. I was even more astonished when Grandma opened the door and let him in. You're bringing Major into the house? We don't have a stove, Grandma said. He's big. He'll add heat to the place. Major took up half the kitchen. The other half was taken up by loaves of bread and chickens. We had chickens in the cupboards, chickens on the shelves, and in the baby carriage, even chickens roosting on Major's back. Our next visitors were Mr. LaFleur and her daughter Madeline. Mrs. LaFleur didn't speak much English. Our house wash away, Mrs. LaFleur said. We row boat here. Madeline looked around the kitchen, and her eyes opened wide. All right, guys, bear with me with the French. Des poules da la chariot de bébé, she said. I guess she'd never seen chickens in a baby carriage before. By nightfall, the house was full to bursting. Besides Mrs. LaFleur and Madeline, Mr. and Mrs. Guthrie, the Fergusons, and the Craig family had moved in. 23 people in all. There were also 3 horses, a cow, 5 pigs, a duck, 4 cats, and 100 chickens. So you can see in the picture all of the people crowding into this space. If you're following along, we are on paragraph 52. The river froze until the house became an island, and we watched our neighbors' houses wash down the river. Mr. and Mrs. Guthrie had brought a side of salt pork with them, though we had no way to cook it. The Fergusons had saved their radio, a skillet, a bag of dried apples, and a three-legged cat. They were delighted to find Major alive and well and in our kitchen. You guys can see that this flood is starting to damage everything. The Craigs had lost everything but the clothes on their back. "We're just glad we all got out alive," Mrs. Craig said, which only reminded Grandma and me that Grandpa had still not returned. We had bread and dried apples for supper, and rainwater Madeline and I scooped out of the LaFleur's rowboat. The water had a few fish scales in it, but no one complained. With no stove or beds, we all huddled together for warmth, sharing Grandma's quilt as best we could. We sang Scottish songs and row, row, row your boat in a round, and Mrs. LaFleur taught us A la Clairefontaine, a tune that brought tears to our eyes even though we couldn't understand the words. Mrs. Guthrie told how her grandfather had fought at Gettysburg, and Mr. Craig kept us laughing with stories of his boyhood days in a logging camp in Maine. If it hadn't been for the thought of Grandpa out there somewhere, it would have almost seemed like a party. I knew Grandma was worried about Grandpa. I was worried too. He should have been home by now. I wanted to ask Peter Ferguson if he would come with me to look for Grandpa, but I knew if Grandma overheard, she'd forbid me to go. So when the sky was getting light, I sneaked out and sprinted for the rowboat. Grandma was just getting into it. "What are you doing here?" she wanted to know. "Same as you, I reckon. Going to look for Grandpa." "It's too dangerous," Grandma said. "Go back to the house." But I shook my head. Grandma looked at me hard. "All right," she said. "We'll look for him together." I pushed us off into water, and that was full of furniture and trees and dead animals. Grandma had to be careful where she rowed. It was raining so hard, I had to keep bailing water out of the boat. Nothing looked the same. Fields had become lakes, just the roofs of houses stuck up above the water. On one of those roofs, we saw a dog. "Why, I believe that's Sam Burroughs' collie," Grandma said, and she rowed toward the house. The collie barked when she saw us coming. I held on to the roof to steady the boat. "Come on, girl," I said, and the dog jumped into the boat beside me. She whined and licked my face. The strangest sight was yet to come. We rounded a bend in the river, and I squinted, sure that my eyes were fooling me. Then I heard Grandma's voice behind me. "Wren, are these old eyes failing me, or is that a cow in the tree?" Grandma asked. It was indeed. A red and white Ayrshire was wedged into the crook form by two branches, and she was bawling piteously. Higher up in the branches was a man. He was hollering almost as loudly as the cow. "I believe we've found your grandpa," Grandma said, relief flooding her face. Can you imagine how she feels right now? How scared to go through an entire night not knowing where your husband or your grandfather or someone very close to you is, and then to find them and they're okay? "I was on my way home when I got swept away by the water," Grandpa said. "I thought I was a goner too, but when this cow floated by, I grabbed her tail and stayed afloat until she got hung up in this tree. We pushed and pulled on that cow, but she was stuck fast, and we finally had to leave her. Grandpa promised he'd come back and try to cut her free, but he was crying as we rode away." "Goodness," Grandma said, "all that fuss over a cow?" But Grandpa wasn't crying over just one cow. "All our cows drowned, Nora," he said. "The house, the barn, the horses, they're all gone." Grandma wiped the tears from his cheeks. "You're safe, and that's all that matters," she said. "We'll have to start over," Grandpa said, and Grandma smiled. "We can do that," she said. Grandpa smiled back at her, and I knew then that no matter what, everything would be all right. The Craigs Fergusons, Guthries, and LaFleurs were glad to see us. Madeline even hugged me. She was afraid you'd drowned, Peter said. He blushed. I was too, he added. When Grandpa saw all the animals in the kitchen, he burst out laughing. Nora, I thought I was building you a house, but I see it was really an ark. It took 3 days for the water to go down enough so our neighbors could go see what was left of their farms. Grandpa put his arm around Grandma. I'll finish the house the way you want it, Nora, he said, but he shook his head when the Fergusons led Major out. I don't know as I'll ever be able to get those hoof prints out of this floor, he said. I've now lived in my grandparents' house for more than 40 years, and those hoof prints are still in the floor. I never sanded them out because they remind me of what's important. Family and friends and neighbors helping neighbors. Like Grandma said, everything else is just gravy. I really enjoyed this story. I think it had a great message at the end, which is something that's also important to historical fiction. They even revealed what the message was at the end, that it's not the things in life that matters. It's your family, it's the people you love, it's your friends, and all of these people came together to support one another in such a terrible time. As you go back through this story again, pay attention to the point of view and the details that are revealing what the thoughts of the main characters are. How do you think Ren and Grandma thought about having a horse in the house? Okay. What was Ren's point of view of Madeline's reaction in paragraphs 47 through 50? And when you see that, you're going to have to go back through. So I would go back to 47 and read through 50 to see exactly what they're talking about. And if I look, that's when Madeline began speaking French, and she was asking about the chickens in the baby carriage because she had never seen that. So she was confused. That is kind of the explanation that I would get. So remember that next week, you are going to have to go back and answer the comprehension questions. So I would maybe take another day to reread the story or listen to this recording. And let me know if you have any questions. Definitely go back and see how those vocabulary words were used to make sure you understand the meaning of those words, and then discuss the story and the message and make sure that you're understanding all these other elements of the historical fiction. What was the setting? It was on a farm in Vermont. Is that a real place? Yes. The characters, Grandma, Grandpa, Ren, Madeline, all of the other families that came to visit. The plot. What happened in the story? What made the story exciting? What were the events that led? What was the main thing that happened? And then what happened afterwards? And we've talked about the point of view, and then we've talked about the theme. I hope you guys enjoyed the story as much as I did. And I will be back in a few.